People weren't just executed, they were sewn, alive, into rotting animal skins, thrown into palace courtyards where starving dogs tore them apart, limb by limb. This punishment was so horrific, it was erased from royal archives. In this story, we expose the queen who ordered it, and the fear she wielded like a crown. If you're drawn to real, raw history that reveals how dark the past truly was, please like, leave a comment, and tell us which city you're watching from. We're building a global community of truth seekers, and your comment shows us how far these forgotten stories still reach. In the shadow of the Byzantine Empire's golden age, when Constantinople's domes caught the morning sun like captured fire and silk traders carried fortunes across continents, there ruled a woman whose name was deliberately erased from history. The chroniclers called her Theodora the Merciless, though that was not her birth name. Modern historians know her only through fragments, scraps of parchment hidden in monastery walls, whispered references in diplomatic correspondence, and the nightmares of those who survived her reign. She was never supposed to rule. Born the third daughter of a minor provincial governor, Theodora's path to power was carved through betrayal, seduction, and methodical elimination of anyone who stood between her and the throne. Her story begins not in palaces, but in the dusty administrative offices of Anatolia, where her father managed tax collection for the imperial bureaucracy. The Byzantine court of the 10th century was a labyrinth of intrigue, where survival depended on reading the subtle language of glances, the careful placement of words, and the ability to eliminate rivals before they recognized you as a threat. Theodora learned these lessons early, watching her father navigate the treacherous waters of provincial politics. When barbarian raiders killed him during a tax collection expedition, she was barely 16. Orphaned, penniless, and completely invisible to the power structures that controlled her world. But invisibility, she would learn, could be the greatest weapon of all. Her first step toward power came through marriage to Nikephoros Palaiologos, a wealthy landowner twice her age whose previous wives had died under mysterious circumstances. The marriage was arranged by distant relatives who saw it as their duty to secure the orphaned girl's future. But Theodora had her own plans. Within 6 months of their wedding, Nikephoros was dead, officially from a fever, though the court physicians noted unusual symptoms that suggested poisoning. As a young widow, Theodora inherited her husband's estates and, more importantly, his connections to the imperial court. She moved to Constantinople with a small retinue of servants, presenting herself as a grieving widow seeking the protection of the church and the emperor's justice. Her beauty was striking but not ostentatious. Dark hair that caught light like polished obsidian, pale skin that suggested noble birth, and eyes that observers described as disturbingly intelligent. Her rise through the court hierarchy was methodical and ruthless. She began by positioning herself as a confidant to the Empress Anna, the emperor's elderly wife who was known for her piety and her paranoia about palace conspiracies. Theodora's background in provincial administration made her useful for managing the empress's charitable foundations, and her apparent devotion to Orthodox Christianity earned her a reputation for moral rectitude. But behind this facade of religious devotion and administrative competence, Theodora was building a network of informants and allies that would eventually span the entire empire. She cultivated relationships with palace guards, kitchen staff, seamstresses, and scribes, the invisible people who saw everything and were seen by no one. Through carefully placed bribes, subtle blackmail, and the occasional strategic seduction, she created an intelligence network that rivaled the emperor's own spy service. Her opportunity came during the crisis of succession that followed Emperor John's death. The legitimate heir, his nephew Constantine, was weak-willed and more interested in theological debates than governing. Theodora had been carefully positioning herself as an indispensable advisor to the imperial family, and when Constantine assumed the throne, she was one of the few people he trusted completely. The new emperor's trust proved to be his fatal mistake. Within a year of his coronation, Constantine was dead, officially from a hunting accident, though several witnesses noted that Theodora had been the one to suggest the particular forest where the accident occurred. With no clear heir and the empire facing threats from Arab raiders and Bulgarian kingdoms, the Senate turned to the one person who seemed to understand both the administrative machinery of government and the deadly realities of palace politics. Theodora's coronation as empress was unprecedented. No woman had ruled the Byzantine Empire in her own right for over a century. But the political crisis demanded extraordinary measures, and her supporters argued that her administrative experience and her apparent loyalty to Orthodox Christianity made her the ideal candidate to restore stability. What they didn't realize was that they had just placed a monster on the throne. The early months of Theodora's reign seemed to validate the Senate's choice. She moved swiftly to shore up the empire's defenses, negotiated successful truces with external enemies, and implemented administrative reforms that increased tax revenues while reducing corruption. Foreign ambassadors reported that she was intelligent, well-informed, and surprisingly effective at managing the complex machinery of imperial government. But within the palace walls, a different story was unfolding. Theodora's paranoia about potential threats had begun to manifest in increasingly brutal ways. She trusted no one completely, not her advisors, not her generals, not even the servants who had helped her rise to power. Every conversation was potentially treasonous. Every glance might hide assassination plans. Every gesture could signal the beginning of a conspiracy. Her first victim was Anna Komnenos, a lady-in-waiting who had served 3 previous empresses and was respected throughout the court for her discretion and loyalty. Anna's crime was simple. She had been overheard commenting to another servant that the new empress seemed troubled by dark thoughts. The remark was innocent, perhaps even sympathetic, but Theodora interpreted it as evidence of disloyalty. Traditional Byzantine punishments for servants included exile, imprisonment, or in extreme cases, execution by sword or hanging. But Theodora had studied the histories of earlier empires, and she had read accounts of more creative forms of execution used by Assyrian kings and Roman emperors. She was particularly fascinated by the ancient practice of throwing condemned criminals into pits with wild animals, and she began to develop her own variation on this theme. The punishment she devised was so horrific that even the palace executioners initially refused to carry it out. Anna Komnenos would be sewn alive into the fresh hide of a slaughtered ox and thrown into the palace courtyard where the imperial hunting dogs were kept. The dogs, deliberately starved for several days beforehand, would be released to attack what they perceived as fresh meat. When Master Torquatus, the chief executioner, protested that such a punishment was beneath the dignity of Christian rulers, Theodora had him flogged and demoted. She personally supervised the selection of his replacement, a man whose loyalty was ensured through a combination of generous payment and absolute terror. The execution took place at dawn in a small courtyard behind the imperial kitchens, where the sounds would be muffled by distance and the busy noise of meal preparation. Anna Komnenos was forced into the still warm hide of an ox that had been slaughtered the previous evening, and palace tailors, working under armed guard, stitched her inside using thick leather needles and sinew thread. A Byzantine chronicler named Michael Attaliates, whose account was discovered in a monastery vault centuries later, described the scene in fragmentary notes that he apparently hid for fear of execution. She ordered her bound, not in chains but in skin. The woman's cries were muffled by the hide, and when the dogs came, they did not see a human but only meat. God forgive us, we stood and watched, for to close our eyes meant to join her. The execution served multiple purposes beyond simply eliminating a perceived threat. It demonstrated to the entire palace staff that Theodora's punishments would be unlike anything they had experienced under previous rulers. It established her willingness to use methods that violated both Christian principles and basic human dignity. And it created an atmosphere of terror that would make future conspiracies far more difficult to organize. But perhaps most importantly, it revealed that the woman now ruling the Byzantine Empire was not merely ruthless, she was genuinely sadistic. The traditional accounts suggest that she watched the entire execution from a palace window, and several witnesses reported that she appeared to smile as Anna's screams echoed through the courtyard. Within weeks of Anna's death, the palace had been transformed from a place of intrigue and political maneuvering into something resembling a prison where the inmates were never sure which of them would be selected for the empress's next demonstration of creative punishment. Servants began to avoid eye contact with their superiors. Conversations were reduced to the absolute minimum necessary for performing duties, and many staff members requested transfers to imperial outposts in distant provinces, transfers that were rarely granted. Theodora had discovered that fear was a more effective tool for maintaining control than loyalty, respect, or even financial incentive, and she had found a method of execution that was so horrifying that merely describing it was enough to ensure compliance with her wishes. The palace dogs, fed on human flesh, had become symbols of imperial power more terrifying than any army. The Byzantine Empire had been ruled by many cruel emperors throughout its history, but none had combined Theodora's intelligence, paranoia, and creative sadism. Her reign would last 7 years, and by its end, the very foundations of imperial government would be transformed by the culture of terror she had created. But in those early months of her rule, as news of Anna Komnenos's fate spread through whispered conversations in palace corridors, few could have imagined just how much worse things would become. The process that Theodora developed for her unique form of execution was not the result of momentary rage or spontaneous cruelty. It was a carefully designed system of terror, refined through practice and perfected through the application of intelligence that should have been used for governing an empire. The empress had studied the logistics of fear with the same methodical approach that previous rulers had applied to military strategy or economic policy. The preparation began days before each execution in the imperial slaughterhouses located in the palace complex's lower levels. Theodora had issued specific instructions about which animals were to be used and how their carcasses were to be prepared. Oxen were preferred for adult victims because their hides were large enough to completely enclose a human body, while smaller animals like goats or sheep were reserved for children, a detail that reveals the systematic nature of her planning. Master Andreas the Butcher, whose detailed records survived in fragmentary form, documented the empress's requirements. The beasts must be slaughtered at sunset and kept fresh until dawn. The hide must be removed in a single piece with no cuts that would allow the condemned to escape. The blood must not be fully drained, for it serves to attract the hounds and mask the human scent that might otherwise cause them hesitation. The selection of victims followed no predictable pattern, which was precisely the point. Theodora understood that random terror was far more effective than punishment that could be anticipated or avoided through careful behavior. A kitchen maid might be condemned for accidentally breaking a plate, while a high-ranking advisor who had openly disagreed with imperial policy might be overlooked entirely. The arbitrariness was deliberate. It meant that everyone, regardless of rank or behavior, lived in constant fear of selection. Helena Kantokouzenos, a former palace seamstress, whose testimony was recorded by monks after she fled to a convent, described the atmosphere that pervaded the palace. "We learned to move like ghosts, to speak in whispers, to avoid any action that might draw attention. Yet attention could come regardless, for breathing too loudly, for looking in the wrong direction, for simply being present when the empress was in a dark mood. We began to pray not for forgiveness of our sins, but for invisibility." When a victim was selected, the process began with their confinement in the palace dungeons. Unlike traditional prisoners who might be held for days or weeks before execution, Theodora's victims were typically confined for no more than a single night. This brevity was not an act of mercy. It was a practical consideration designed to maintain the element of surprise that made her reign of terror so effective. The actual preparation for execution took place in a chamber beneath the palace that had originally been designed as a wine cellar. Theodora had ordered it converted into what she called her workshop, a space equipped with the tools and materials necessary for her unique form of execution. The chamber contained tables for restraining victims, racks for stretching animal hides, and a collection of specialized needles and thread that had been manufactured specifically for sewing human beings into animal skins. The work was performed by palace tailors who had been selected not for their skill with fabric, but for their ability to work quickly and efficiently while their subjects writhed in terror. These men, for they were all men, as Theodora believed women would be too squeamish for such work, were paid extraordinary salaries and housed in comfortable quarters. But they were also virtual prisoners who were never allowed to leave the palace complex. Master Stephanos the tailor, whose account was discovered hidden in the walls of his quarters, described the process in clinical detail. The condemned is placed upon the table and restrained with leather straps. The animal hide is stretched over them like a second skin, with only small openings left for the nose and mouth to prevent suffocation before the entertainment begins. We use curved needles, each as long as a man's finger, and thread made from the strongest sinew. The stitches must be close together and pulled tight, for the victim's struggles would otherwise allow escape. The psychological torture of this process was as carefully orchestrated as the physical aspects. Victims were forced to remain conscious throughout the procedure, listening to the sound of needle-piercing leather and feeling the gradual enclosure of their bodies within the confining animal hide. Some tried to bargain or confess to imaginary crimes, while others retreated into prayer or catatonic silence. A few fought until the very end, though their resistance only served to provide additional entertainment for the empress, who often observed the preparation personally. The choice of animal hide was not arbitrary. Oxen were preferred because their thick hides provided durability, while their scent was particularly attractive to dogs. But Theodora also used the species of animal as a form of symbolic punishment. Servants accused of laziness might be sewn into donkey hides, while those suspected of sexual impropriety were enclosed in goat skins. Kitchen staff were typically punished using pig hides, a choice that reflected both practical availability and symbolic appropriateness. The dogs used for these executions were not ordinary palace pets or hunting hounds. Theodora had commissioned the training of a special pack of animals that were bred specifically for aggression and conditioned to associate the scent of animal hides with feeding time. These dogs were kept in kennels beneath the palace and fed a diet that included raw meat mixed with small amounts of human blood, a conditioning technique that made them more likely to attack human victims without hesitation. Master Cyrus the dog keeper, whose duties included maintaining this pack, left behind notes that reveal the systematic nature of their training. The beasts are never allowed to feed until they have torn apart their prey. We withhold food for 3 days before each execution so that hunger drives them to greater savagery. They have been taught to respond to the horn signal that announces feeding time, and they associate this sound with the tearing of flesh and the taste of blood. The execution itself took place in a small courtyard that had been modified specifically for this purpose. High walls prevented escape and muffled sounds, while drainage channels allowed blood to flow away from the central area where the condemned would be placed. The empress typically watched from a specially constructed viewing platform that provided an unobstructed view while keeping her safely removed from the violence below. The victim, now completely enclosed in animal hide except for breathing holes, would be carried to the center of the courtyard and placed on the stone floor. The dogs would be released from their kennels, and the horn signal would announce that feeding time had begun. What followed was not a quick death. It was prolonged torture that could last for hours as the animals gradually tore through the hide to reach the flesh beneath. Contemporary accounts describe scenes of unimaginable horror. The dogs, following their training, would begin by circling their prey and testing the strength of the hide with small bites. Gradually, they would find weak points in the stitching or areas where the hide was thinner, and they would begin to tear openings. The victim's struggles would only increase the animal's excitement, as movement was associated with living prey that needed to be subdued. Brother Maximos of the Studios Monastery, who served as palace chaplain during part of Theodora's reign, left behind a coded account that required centuries to decipher. The screams begin when the beasts find purchase upon the hide, and they continue until the voice can no longer draw breath. Some of the condemned beg for mercy even when their words are muffled by leather and death. The empress watches with the expression of one observing a theatrical performance, sometimes calling out instructions to her hounds as if directing actors upon a stage. The duration of these executions varied depending on several factors: the thickness of the hide, the size and conditioning of the victim, the hunger of the dogs, and sometimes the empress's mood. Some victims died from shock or heart failure before the animals could reach them, while others endured hours of gradual dismemberment. The longest recorded execution lasted from dawn until midday, with the victim remaining conscious for most of that time. Perhaps most disturbing was Theodora's practice of using different numbers of dogs, depending on the perceived severity of the victim's crime. Minor offenses might merit only 2 or 3 animals, ensuring a relatively quick death. But serious crimes, or simply actions that particularly annoyed the empress, could result in the release of the entire pack, sometimes more than a dozen hungry dogs descending upon a single victim. The cleanup following each execution was assigned to a special detail of palace servants who had been selected for their strong stomachs and absolute discretion. These men were required to gather the remains of both victim and animal hide, clean the blood from the courtyard stones, and prepare the space for its next use. They were also responsible for feeding any leftover flesh to the dogs, ensuring that nothing was wasted and that the animals maintained their association between the scent of animal hides and the reward of fresh meat. The psychological impact of these executions extended far beyond the immediate terror experienced by those who witnessed them. Palace servants developed elaborate superstitions designed to avoid attracting the empress's attention. Some wore multiple layers of religious medallions, believing that spiritual protection might ward off selection. Others adopted particular patterns of behavior, always walking on the right side of corridors, never speaking above a whisper, avoiding eye contact with anyone of higher rank. The empress seemed to take particular pleasure in the unpredictability of her selections. She might spare a servant who had committed serious errors while condemning another for trivial mistakes. This randomness served to maintain maximum fear while preventing the development of any reliable strategy for survival. In a palace where everyone lived in terror, no one could feel safe enough to organize resistance. But the most chilling aspect of Theodora's systematic use of this punishment was how it gradually became normalized within the palace culture. New servants and officials were warned about the empress's methods as part of their orientation, and veteran staff developed strategies for protecting newcomers from accidentally triggering her wrath. The horror of watching human beings sewn into animal skins and torn apart by dogs became just another occupational hazard in the service of the Byzantine Empire. As word of these executions began to spread beyond the palace walls, they served an additional purpose: preventing external threats to Theodora's rule. Foreign ambassadors reported the rumors to their own courts, and potential rebels within the empire learned that capture would not result in clean execution or honorable imprisonment, but in a death so horrific that most preferred suicide to the risk of falling into the empress's hands. The system Theodora had created was self-reinforcing. Each execution generated fear that prevented resistance, while the absence of resistance convinced her that the method was effective and justified its continued use. She had transformed the palace into a machine for producing terror, with herself as its engineer and her servants as its fuel. The punishment that Theodora perfected was not her own invention, but rather a culmination of torture methods that stretched back through millennia of human cruelty. To understand how a Byzantine empress came to devise such a horrific form of execution, we must trace the dark thread of similar practices through ancient civilizations that viewed the combination of human suffering and animal violence as both practical punishment and divine justice. The earliest recorded instance of using animal skins as instruments of execution appears in Assyrian records from the 9th century BCE. King Ashurnasirpal II, whose reign was characterized by methodical brutality designed to prevent rebellion, documented the punishment of prisoners taken during his conquest of Mesopotamian city-states. Assyrian bas-reliefs, discovered in the ruins of Nimrud, depict captives being flayed alive and their skins displayed on city walls as warnings to potential rebels. But the Assyrians went further than simple flaying. Royal annals describe a punishment reserved for the most serious offenders. Captured enemy commanders were sewn into the fresh hides of sacrificial bulls and exposed to wild dogs that had been trained for warfare. The practice served multiple purposes within Assyrian military doctrine. It eliminated leadership from conquered territories, provided entertainment for troops, and created psychological weapons that could be described to future enemies. Dr. Sarah Melville of Claremont McKenna College, whose research into Assyrian military practices has revealed previously unknown details about these executions, notes that they were not random acts of sadism, but calculated components of an imperial strategy designed to minimize resistance through maximum terror. The Assyrians understood that a reputation for creative brutality could be more effective than actual military superiority in maintaining control over conquered territories. The practice spread through cultural exchange and military conquest to other ancient civilizations. Scythian burial sites in modern-day Ukraine have yielded archaeological evidence of ritual sacrifices involving animal skins, though these appear to have been religious ceremonies rather than punishments. More relevant to Theodora's methods are Persian records from the Achaemenid period, which describe similar punishments being used against satraps who were suspected of disloyalty to the empire. Perhaps most significantly, the practice found its way into Roman law through contact with eastern territories. The Roman punishment of poena culae, traditionally reserved for those convicted of patricide, involved sewing the condemned into a leather sack along with a dog, a rooster, a viper, and a monkey, then throwing the entire bundle into a river. While this differed from Theodora's method in its specific execution, it shared the fundamental concept of using animal confinement as a form of degrading punishment. Marcus Tullius Cicero, in his defense speeches, described poena culae as a punishment that reduces the condemned below the level of beasts, for even animals are not forced to share their death with creatures they did not choose as companions. The Roman legal tradition viewed this form of execution as particularly appropriate for crimes that violated natural law, such as the murder of parents, because it symbolically stripped the condemned of their humanity. The Byzantine Empire inherited much of its legal framework from Rome, but it also incorporated influences from the Eastern territories that had been absorbed during imperial expansion. Theodora's innovation was to combine Roman legal concepts with Assyrian military practices and Persian methods of psychological warfare, creating a form of execution that served her particular needs as an autocratic ruler governing through fear. However, Theodora's version differed from these historical precedents in several crucial ways that reveal her particular genius for terror. Ancient rulers had typically reserved such punishments for captured enemies or those convicted of the most serious crimes. Theodora applied them to her own servants and officials, transforming a military tactic into a tool of domestic governance. She also refined the process to maximize both psychological impact and duration of suffering, turning what had been relatively quick executions into prolonged spectacles of horror. The religious context of these punishments also evolved significantly by Theodora's time. Ancient civilizations had often viewed the use of animals in executions as a form of divine justice. The condemned were being judged by creatures closer to the gods than human authorities. Early Christianity, however, emphasized human dignity and the possibility of redemption even for the worst sinners. The use of animals to execute humans was seen as fundamentally incompatible with Christian teaching about the sanctity of human life. This religious tension may explain why Theodora took such care to keep her methods secret from church authorities, and why records of these executions were systematically destroyed. Father Gregorios of the Hagia Sophia, whose encrypted letters were discovered in monastery archives, wrote, "The Empress claims to rule as God's appointed representative on earth, yet she employs methods that would shame the pagan emperors of old. How can she face the altar knowing that she has reduced human beings, created in God's image, to mere entertainment for beasts?" The symbolic aspects of Theodora's punishment were as carefully constructed as its practical elements. By sewing victims into animal hides, she was literally transforming them into animals in the eyes of the dogs that would attack them. This dehumanization served both to reduce any psychological barriers that might prevent the dogs from attacking and to send a clear message about how the Empress viewed those who displeased her. The choice of dogs as executioners was also symbolically significant. Throughout Byzantine culture, dogs were associated with loyalty, obedience, and service to masters. By training these animals to attack and kill human beings, Theodora was demonstrating that even the most loyal creatures would turn against humans at her command. The message to her servants was clear. If dogs could be turned into killers, what hope did humans have of maintaining independence from her will? Modern historians studying Theodora's methods have noted parallels with psychological warfare techniques used by more recent totalitarian regimes. Dr. Robert Conquest, in his analysis of Soviet punishment systems, observed that the most effective forms of terror are those that violate basic assumptions about human dignity and social order. When people can no longer predict what behaviors will ensure safety, they become psychologically dependent on the authority figure who controls their fate. Theodora's systematic use of animal skin executions represented a refinement of this principle. By making the punishment so bizarre and horrific that it seemed to exist outside normal categories of human experience, she created a form of terror that was particularly effective at breaking down psychological resistance. Servants who might have been willing to risk traditional punishments, like imprisonment or even execution, found themselves paralyzed by the prospect of such an alien and degrading death. The influence of her methods extended beyond the immediate political realm into Byzantine culture more broadly. References to animal skin punishments began appearing in religious texts as examples of demonic torture, and popular stories often featured villains who threatened heroes with similar fates. The cultural impact persisted long after Theodora's death, influencing Byzantine literature and religious imagery for generations. Archaeological evidence from palace sites dating to Theodora's reign has provided physical confirmation of some historical accounts. Excavations beneath the modern Topkapi Palace have revealed drainage systems and stone platforms that matched descriptions of execution courtyards, along with animal bones showing evidence of systematic butchering for hide removal. Perhaps most chillingly, human remains found in these areas show bite marks consistent with large dog attacks, providing forensic evidence for practices that many historians had dismissed as exaggeration. The international response to rumors about Theodora's methods reveals their impact beyond Byzantine borders. Diplomatic correspondence from the Papal States, preserved in Vatican archives, includes warnings to other Christian rulers about the abominations being committed in Constantinople. Arab chroniclers of the period wrote with horror about Byzantine practices that exceeded even their own culture's acceptance of creative punishment. These international reactions may have contributed to Theodora's eventual downfall, as they made it difficult for the Byzantine Empire to maintain alliances and trade relationships with neighboring powers. The empress's domestic terror tactics had achieved their goal of preventing internal rebellion, but they had also isolated her empire diplomatically at a time when external threats were increasing. The evolution of animal skin executions, from ancient military tactics to Theodora's refined system of domestic terror, represents a dark chapter in the history of human creativity applied to suffering. It demonstrates how techniques developed for use against external enemies can be turned inward against a ruler's own subjects, and how the combination of intelligence, resources, and unlimited power can produce innovations in cruelty that challenge our understanding of human nature. Most importantly, it reveals how historical practices that might seem impossibly barbaric to modern sensibilities were actually the result of careful planning and systematic development. Theodora's methods were not the products of momentary rage or primitive ignorance. They were sophisticated tools of political control that drew upon centuries of human experience with terror as a means of governance. The transformation of the imperial palace from a center of governance into a theater of systematic terror was gradual but inexorable. What began as isolated executions designed to eliminate specific threats evolved into a regular schedule of violence that pervaded every aspect of palace life. By the third year of Theodora's reign, the sound of dogs howling in the lower courtyards had become as routine as the call to morning prayers, and the sight of servants being dragged to the dungeons was no more remarkable than the daily delivery of fresh bread to the kitchens. The empress had discovered that the most effective terror was not sporadic violence driven by rage, but rather systematic brutality conducted with the methodical precision of administrative routine. She established what court records euphemistically called cleansing schedules, regular intervals at which examples would be made of palace staff to maintain appropriate levels of fear and obedience among the survivors. These executions typically occurred every 10 to 14 days, a frequency that Theodora had calculated to maintain maximum psychological impact while preserving enough staff to actually operate the palace. Too frequent executions would have left her without sufficient servants to maintain the complex machinery of imperial government, while periods longer than 2 weeks allowed fear to fade and potentially dangerous levels of confidence to develop among the staff. The selection process for these regular executions was particularly diabolical in its apparent randomness. Theodora would conduct what she called inspection tours of palace operations, accompanied by her personal guard and a scribe who recorded her observations. During these tours, she would engage servants in seemingly casual conversation, asking about their duties, their families, their opinions on palace operations, and their observations about their fellow workers. These conversations were elaborate traps designed to identify potential threats and create justifications for punishment. A servant who spoke too enthusiastically about their work might be condemned for excessive ambition that could lead to sedition. One who seemed fearful might be executed for guilty knowledge that proves disloyalty. Even those who tried to give neutral, minimal responses could be punished for insolence in providing inadequate information to the empress. Master Constantine Ducas, a palace administrator whose encrypted journal was discovered hidden in the walls of his office, described the psychological torture of these inspection tours. We learned to dread the sound of her footsteps more than the tolling of funeral bells. When she approached, we would freeze like mice sensing the presence of a cat, knowing that any movement, any word, any expression might provide her with excuse for condemnation. Yet stillness too could be interpreted as guilt, and silence as evidence of conspiracy. There was no safe response to her attention, only the hope that she would pass by without notice. The empress seemed to take particular pleasure in targeting servants who had shown loyalty or exceptional competence in their duties. This was not coincidental. It was a deliberate strategy designed to prevent the development of any reliable pathway to safety through good behavior. By occasionally executing the most dedicated workers alongside those who had made obvious mistakes, she ensured that no one could predict survival through performance or loyalty. One of the most documented cases involved Maria Palaiologina, the empress's personal seamstress, who had served the imperial family for over 15 years and was widely regarded as one of the most skilled craftspeople in the empire. Maria had created the elaborate ceremonial robes worn during Theodora's coronation and had received personal commendations from the empress for her artistry and discretion. Her crime was discovered during one of Theodora's routine inspections of the palace workshops. While examining Maria's work area, the empress noticed a small cross that the seamstress had embroidered into the inner lining of a ceremonial robe, a traditional practice meant to invoke divine protection for the wearer. Theodora declared this unauthorized religious symbol to be evidence of secret communication with enemies of the state who might use such signs to identify loyal servants who could be turned against the throne. The accusation was transparently false. Religious symbols in imperial garments were traditional and had been common practice for centuries. But the absurdity of the charge was precisely the point. By executing someone for an action that was obviously innocent, Theodora demonstrated that guilt or innocence was irrelevant to her punishments. The only thing that mattered was her will, and her will was unpredictable and absolute. Maria's execution was conducted with particular ceremony, as Theodora wanted to ensure that the lesson was not lost on other palace craftspeople. The seamstress was sewn into the hide of a white bull that had been sacrificed specifically for the occasion, and the empress personally selected 7 dogs from her trained pack to serve as executioners. The execution was scheduled for midday and conducted in the main courtyard, where it could be observed by the maximum number of palace staff. Brother Nikephoros, the palace chaplain who was forced to witness the execution, left behind a coded account that was not deciphered until the 19th century. The woman who had clothed emperors in glory was herself clothed in death and torn apart by beasts. Her screams echoed through marble halls where once she had been praised for her skill. The empress watched from her balcony with the expression of a connoisseur observing fine art, calling instructions to her hounds as if conducting a choir of demons. The impact of Maria's execution on the palace staff was exactly what Theodora had intended. The other seamstresses and craftspeople were paralyzed by fear, unable to work effectively while constantly wondering which of their traditional practices might be reinterpreted as treasonous activity. Productivity in the workshops plummeted as workers spent more time trying to anticipate and avoid potential accusations than actually performing their duties. But this decline in efficiency did not concern the empress. She had calculated that ruling through terror was more important than maintaining optimal administrative function, and she was prepared to accept reduced palace operations as the price of absolute control. Her philosophy, as recorded in fragments of her personal correspondence, was that an inefficient palace ruled by fear is preferable to an efficient palace that harbors rebellion. The pattern of seemingly random executions continued throughout the 4th year of Theodora's reign, but the empress began to introduce new variations designed to maintain the psychological impact of her methods. Sometimes she would announce that an execution would take place without identifying the victim until the last moment, forcing the entire palace staff to live in suspense for days or weeks. Other times, she would pardon someone who had already been prepared for execution, demonstrating her power to grant life as arbitrarily as she imposed death. One particularly cruel innovation involved the execution of Euphrosina Kantokouzenos, the palace head cook, who had been responsible for preparing meals for the imperial family for over a decade. Euphrosine's supposed crime was serving soup that was insufficiently seasoned during a state dinner for foreign ambassadors, an oversight that Theodora claimed had diminished the empire's reputation and provided aid to its enemies. But instead of proceeding immediately to execution, Theodora announced that Euphrosine would be given an opportunity to redeem herself through service. The cook was assigned to prepare the meals that would be fed to the execution dogs, a task that required her to handle raw meat and blood while knowing that she was essentially preparing the instruments of her own death. For 3 months, Euphrosine was forced to feed and care for the animals that would eventually tear her apart. She had to mix human blood into their regular diet, condition them to associate certain scents with feeding time, and maintain their health and aggression levels. The psychological torture of this arrangement was exquisite. Every day she worked was another day of life, but it was also another day of preparing for her own horrific death. The other palace staff were forced to watch this prolonged torment, understanding that it demonstrated how the Empress could extend suffering indefinitely if she chose. The message was clear. Death might be a mercy compared to the creative punishments that Theodora could devise for those who displeased her. Euphrosyne's final execution, when it came, was conducted with elaborate ceremony. She was sewn into the hide of a prize hunting boar that had been specially selected for its thick skin and strong scent. The dogs she had been feeding for months were released into the courtyard, and they attacked with particular savagery, not because they recognized their former caretaker, but because they had been conditioned to associate her scent with feeding time. The Empress observed this execution from a specially constructed platform that allowed her to see every detail of the violence. According to eyewitness accounts, she provided running commentary on the dog's performance, praising particularly effective attacks and critiquing their technique when they seemed insufficiently aggressive. She had transformed judicial execution into a form of entertainment that satisfied her sadistic impulses while serving her political goals. By the 5th year of her reign, Theodora had refined her system to include what she called educational executions, designed to teach specific lessons to particular groups within the palace hierarchy. Kitchen staff who witnessed Euphrosyne's death learned about the consequences of culinary failures. Seamstresses who had watched Maria's execution understood the dangers of unauthorized creativity. Guards who observed the punishment of their colleagues learned about the importance of absolute loyalty. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating innovation was Theodora's introduction of voluntary executions. Servants who were facing minor punishments, flogging, reduced rations, temporary imprisonment, were given the option of choosing death by animal skin execution instead. The choice was presented as an act of imperial mercy, allowing the condemned to accept their fate with dignity rather than enduring prolonged suffering. Incredibly, some servants chose this option. The palace had become so pervaded by terror that a quick death, even one involving being torn apart by dogs, seemed preferable to the uncertainty of continued life under Theodora's rule. These voluntary executions served to demonstrate that the Empress's power extended beyond the ability to impose death. She could make her subjects grateful for the privilege of dying in her service. Anna Komnenos, a different Anna from the first victim, a young woman who served as a palace laundress, became famous for choosing animal skin execution rather than accepting a sentence of 50 lashes for accidentally damaging an imperial garment. Her final words, as recorded by witnesses, were, "I would rather die once as a human being than live forever as a slave to a monster." Anna's choice sparked what court records euphemistically called the contagion of despair. Several other servants, facing various minor punishments, requested permission to choose execution instead. Some appeared to be making rational calculations that death was preferable to continued life in the palace. Others seemed to have suffered psychological breakdowns that left them incapable of distinguishing between different forms of suffering. Theodora initially granted these requests, viewing them as evidence of her complete psychological dominance over her subjects, but she eventually realized that too many voluntary executions would deprive her of the staff necessary to maintain palace operations. She began refusing such requests, forcing servants to live with their punishments and their fear, rather than allowing them the escape of death. This refusal to permit voluntary execution became another form of torture. Servants who had reached the psychological breaking point where death seemed like relief were forced to continue living in an environment that had driven them to that breaking point. Some developed what modern psychology would recognize as severe depression and anxiety disorders. Others retreated into catatonic states that made them barely functional as workers. The cumulative effect of these systematic terrors was to transform the imperial palace from a functioning administrative center into something resembling a concentration camp. Normal human relationships became impossible when anyone might be selected for execution at any time. Trust was eliminated when every conversation might be reported and reinterpreted as evidence of disloyalty. Hope was systematically crushed when good behavior provided no protection against arbitrary punishment. Yet the palace continued to operate after a fashion. The fear that paralyzed individual initiative also ensured absolute compliance with direct orders. Servants who might have taken shortcuts or made independent decisions under previous rulers now followed instructions with mechanical precision, terrified of any deviation that might be interpreted as insubordination. The international diplomatic consequences of these domestic terrors began to manifest during state visits from foreign dignitaries. Ambassador reports from the period describe a palace where normal social interactions had been replaced by an atmosphere of barely controlled panic. Foreign visitors noted that palace servants seemed more like frightened animals than human beings, and that the empress herself appeared to take pleasure in demonstrating her power over her terrorized staff. Prince Vladimir of Kiev, visiting Constantinople to negotiate a trade agreement, wrote to his brother, "The Byzantine empress rules not through law or tradition, but through pure terror that has reduced her subjects to the level of beaten dogs. I have seen conquered cities with more dignity among their inhabitants than exists in this palace. Whatever military strength the empire retains, its moral authority has been utterly destroyed by the woman who sits upon its throne." These diplomatic observations were not merely matters of protocol or courtesy. They reflected growing international recognition that the Byzantine Empire under Theodora had become a rogue state whose domestic practices violated the basic norms of Christian civilization. This recognition would eventually contribute to the isolation that made her regime vulnerable to the rebellion that would end her reign. But in the immediate term, the empress's systematic use of terror served its intended purpose. The palace staff lived in such fear that organized resistance was virtually impossible. Even private conversations between servants became dangerous, as anyone might report suspicious remarks in hope of gaining favor or avoiding suspicion themselves. The culture of terror had become self-perpetuating, requiring less direct intervention from Theodora as her subjects learned to police themselves. The empress had succeeded in creating what she believed was the perfect system of control, one in which her will was enforced not through external coercion, but through the internalized fear of subjects who had learned that survival depended on absolute submission to her unpredictable desires. She had transformed human beings into instruments of her power, just as she had transformed dogs into instruments of execution. Yet this very success would ultimately prove to be her weakness. A system based entirely on fear could only be sustained as long as the source of that fear remained invulnerable. When cracks began to appear in Theodora's armor, when her subjects began to sense that she might not be as all-powerful as she appeared, the terror that had been her greatest weapon would quickly transform into the rage that would destroy her. The beginning of the end for Theodora's reign of terror came not from external enemies or popular uprising, but from an unexpected source: the very dogs that had been her instruments of execution. In the 6th year of her rule, during what should have been a routine execution of a kitchen servant accused of stealing bread, something went wrong with the elaborate system she had created. The condemned man, a young baker named Thomas Lascaris, had been sewn into a bull hide according to standard procedure and placed in the execution courtyard. But when the starved dogs were released, they did not immediately attack. Instead, they circled the writhing figure with apparent confusion, whining and backing away when Thomas's muffled cries reached them. For nearly an hour, while Theodora watched in growing rage, the dogs refused to fulfill their function. Master Cyrus, the dog-keeper, later speculated that the animals had begun to associate human screams with their own conditioning rather than with feeding time. The months of forcing them to attack humans sewn into animal hides had created psychological trauma in the animals themselves. They had learned to recognize the difference between actual animal prey and humans disguised as animals, and some instinctive reluctance to attack their own species had begun to reassert itself. The failure of the execution system in front of an audience of palace servants and visiting officials was a devastating blow to Theodora's carefully constructed image of omnipotence. For the first time since her reign began, her subjects witnessed evidence that her power had limits. The dogs, which had been symbols of her absolute authority, had revealed themselves to be as vulnerable to psychological breakdown as the humans they were meant to terrorize. Theodora's response to this crisis was characteristically brutal. She ordered the immediate execution of Master Cyrus and his entire staff of dog-keepers, blaming them for the animals' failure. But this reaction only served to highlight the problem rather than solving it. If the Empress needed to execute her own specialists to maintain her system, what did that say about the system's stability? More importantly, word of the failed execution began to spread beyond the palace walls. Servants who had witnessed the event spoke quietly to family members in the city, and those family members shared the information with neighbors and friends. For the first time, ordinary citizens of Constantinople began to hear stories that suggested the empress might not be as all-powerful as imperial propaganda claimed. The political significance of this development cannot be overstated. Theodora's entire system of governance depended on the perception that resistance was futile because her power was unlimited. Once that perception began to crack, the psychological foundation of her rule started to crumble. If dogs could refuse to obey her, what else might prove resistant to her will? The first concrete evidence of organized resistance appeared 3 months after the failed execution. A palace guard named Michael Palaiologos, whose sister had been one of Theodora's early victims, began quietly contacting other servants whose family members had been executed. These conversations were extraordinarily dangerous. Discovery would have meant immediate death. But they were also inevitable once people began to believe that resistance might be possible. The conspiracy that developed was unlike traditional palace coups that typically involved high-ranking officials competing for power. This rebellion emerged from the bottom of the palace hierarchy, organized by servants, guards, and craftspeople who had lived under Theodora's terror for years. Their goal was not to claim the throne for themselves, but simply to end the systematic brutality that had destroyed so many of their colleagues and family members. The conspirators faced enormous challenges. They had to communicate without attracting attention from the empress's network of informants. They had to coordinate actions across different sections of the palace without revealing their plans to potential traitors. Most difficult of all, they had to overcome years of conditioning that had taught them to view Theodora as an almost supernatural force whose power could not be challenged. Michael Palaiologos emerged as the informal leader of the conspiracy, not because of any special qualifications or noble birth, but because his grief over his sister's death gave him courage that others lacked. His ability to function normally while planning rebellion inspired confidence among potential recruits who had been paralyzed by fear for so long that they had almost forgotten what hope felt like. The conspirators' first major breakthrough came when they recruited Father Maximos, the palace chaplain who had been forced to witness so many executions. His participation was crucial because it provided religious legitimacy for their actions and access to areas of the palace that were normally restricted to lower-ranking servants. More importantly, Father Maximos could frame their rebellion in theological terms that justified violence against a ruler who claimed divine authority. "We do not rebel against God's appointed representative," Father Maximos wrote in coded messages distributed among the conspirators, "but against a demon who has usurped that role through murder and terror. Our duty as Christians is to cast out this evil, not to submit to it in the name of obedience." The conspiracy's plan was necessarily simple because complex coordination would have been impossible given their limited resources and constant surveillance. They would wait for one of Theodora's inspection tours when she would be moving through the palace with only a small guard detail. At a predetermined signal, conspirators throughout the palace would simultaneously attack her supporters, while Michael's group neutralized the Empress herself. The rebellion was scheduled for the feast day of St. Michael the Archangel, chosen both for its symbolic appropriateness and because the religious celebrations would provide cover for unusual movement throughout the palace. The conspirators spent weeks preparing weapons and identifying escape routes, knowing that failure would mean not just death, but death by the horrific methods they had witnessed so many times. On the appointed day, Theodora began her usual inspection tour without any apparent awareness of the danger she faced. Her confidence had been reinforced by years of absolute power, and she seemed incapable of imagining that her terrified subjects might pose any real threat to her safety. This overconfidence proved to be her fatal weakness. The attack began in the palace kitchens, where Theodora was examining bread quality and questioning the baker who had replaced the executed Thomas Lascaris. Michael Palaiologos, who had been assigned to guard duty for the inspection, suddenly drew his sword and struck down the Empress's personal bodyguard. This was the signal for the broader uprising, and throughout the palace, the conspirators emerged from their hiding places to attack designated targets. The fighting was brief but intense. Theodora's supporters were caught completely off guard, having grown complacent after years of ruling through terror without facing any organized resistance. Many of the Empress's most loyal servants were killed in the first few minutes of fighting, before they could organize any effective defense. Theodora herself proved to be a formidable opponent, even when trapped and outnumbered. Contemporary accounts describe her fighting with desperate fury, using a kitchen knife to wound several attackers before being overpowered. Her final words, according to multiple witnesses, were not pleas for mercy or promises of reform, but curses directed at her attackers and threats about the punishments they would face for their treason. The empress's death marked the end of systematic terror in the Byzantine palace, but it did not immediately restore normal conditions. The conspirators, having achieved their primary goal, found themselves uncertain about what to do next. They had planned a rebellion, not a government, and they lacked both the legitimacy and the administrative skills necessary to manage the complex machinery of imperial power. The immediate aftermath of Theodora's death was chaotic. Some conspirators wanted to place Michael Palaiologos on the throne as a reward for his leadership, but he refused, recognizing that he lacked the noble birth and political connections necessary for legitimacy. Others proposed inviting members of the traditional aristocracy to resume power, but many of those families had been eliminated or exiled during Theodora's purges. The solution that eventually emerged was a regency council composed of surviving members of the imperial family, high-ranking church officials, and representatives of the military and merchant classes. This council's first priority was to establish some form of legal continuity that would prevent the empire from dissolving into civil war while a new emperor was chosen. But equally important was the council's decision to systematically erase all evidence of Theodora's methods of rule. This erasure was motivated partly by shame at what the empire had become under her leadership, and partly by practical concerns about the international damage that full disclosure might cause to Byzantine diplomatic relations. The destruction of records began immediately after the empress's death. Palace scribes who had been forced to document executions were ordered to burn their files, and official chronicles were edited to remove specific references to animal skin executions and other torture methods. The empress herself was typically referred to in subsequent documents as the tyrant, or she whose name is cursed, rather than by her actual name. The physical evidence was eliminated as thoroughly as the written records. The execution courtyards were filled with earth and converted to gardens. The specialized equipment used for sewing victims into animal hides was destroyed, and the craftsmen who had created it were relocated to distant provinces where they could not discuss their former work. Even the dogs were killed, as their continued existence would have served as a reminder of the horrors they had been trained to inflict. Most significantly, the new government offered amnesty to palace servants who agreed never to discuss their experiences during Theodora's reign. This policy was designed to prevent the spread of detailed information about torture methods that might inspire future tyrants, but it also had the effect of eliminating potential witnesses who could have provided historical testimony about the period.